His name was Henri Voss, and by 1814 he had spent 22 years drawing rivers that nobody else would draw correctly. Not because other cartographers lacked the skill. The early 19th century was arguably the apex of European cartographic tradition. Men like Arrowsmith in London and Lappy in Paris were producing maps of technical precision that would not be meaningfully surpassed for decades. The instruments were good. The surveying methods were rigorous. The institutional appetite for geographical knowledge, driven by colonial expansion and military necessity, had never been better funded. If you wanted to know where a coastline ended or where a mountain range began, the cartographers of 1814 could tell you with remarkable accuracy. What they could not tell you, what most of them had decided, by professional consensus and institutional pressure, was not worth telling you, was where the rivers actually went. Voss had understood this problem since his early career in Amsterdam, where he had worked as a draftsman for the Dutch East India Company, before leaving under circumstances that his surviving correspondence describes only as a disagreement about what was and was not appropriate to include on a commercial map. He established his own practice in Utrecht in 1798 and spent the next 16 years on the project that would define and ultimately end his professional life, a comprehensive atlas of the world's river systems, drawn not from the secondary sources and copied conventions that most contemporary maps relied upon, but from primary survey data, indigenous geographical accounts, traveller testimony, and his own painstaking cross-referencing of sources that the mainstream cartographic community had largely decided were too old, too foreign, or too inconvenient to take seriously. What he was finding as the atlas took shape across those 16 years was that the river systems of the known world were considerably more interconnected, considerably more recently altered, and in several critical cases considerably larger than the maps that his contemporaries were producing would ever suggest. And he was finding something else, something that he wrote about with increasing urgency in his private letters as 1815 approached. The alterations were not ancient, some of them were not even old. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, you need to understand what a river system actually tells you about a landscape's history. A river does not simply flow, it records. The path a river takes across a terrain is the accumulated result of every geological event, every climate shift, every human intervention that has occurred in that watershed across thousands of years. The meanders, the oxbows, the dry channels where water no longer runs, the elevated plains that were once lake beds, the deltas that push into seas that were once seas, all of it is legible, if you know how to read it, as a chronicle of what the land has been through. A cartographer who draws rivers accurately is not just recording geography. He is reading geological time. What Voss's atlas was showing him, cross-reference by cross-reference, was a chronicle that did not match the standard account. The most significant discrepancy was in Central Asia. The cartographic tradition he was working within had, since the mid-18th century, accepted a particular picture of the river systems draining the interior of the Eurasian continent, the courses of the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, the extent of the Aral Sea basin, the drainage patterns of the steppe region between the Caspian and the Himalayas. Voss had assembled over 12 years of correspondence with Russian military surveyors, Persian merchants, and several Central Asian scholars whose accounts had never been translated into a European language, a picture of that region that diverged from the accepted version in ways that were not explicable as simple measurement error. His sources described a river system that had been, within living memory in some cases, flowing in fundamentally different configurations. Not ancient lake beds, not geological era features. Channels that elderly informants remembered as active waterways within their own lifetimes, that were now dry or redirected or simply absent from the landscape. He found similar patterns in 3 other regions. In West Africa, where the Upper Niger's course had never been accurately mapped by any European cartographer, his compilation of Arab geographical sources and traveller accounts described a watershed connectivity that suggested the Sahara's southern margin had, within a period he estimated at no more than a century and possibly far less, undergone drainage changes of a scale that conventional geographic understanding had no framework to explain. In North America, his cross-referencing of indigenous geographical accounts collected by French Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century against the survey data of British military cartographers in the late 18th century showed discrepancies in the Mississippi Basin's tributary structure that could not be accounted for by the surveying inaccuracies of the earlier period, and in Europe itself, in the great river plains of the Rhine and Danube systems, he had found, in the records of Dutch water management boards and Austro-Hungarian engineering surveys, documentation of drainage pattern changes in the previous century that the official histories of those landscapes had quietly absorbed without explanation. None of this, individually, constituted proof of anything. Rivers change, climates shift, human engineering redirects water. Voss was not unaware of these explanations, and his private letters show a man arguing constantly with himself about how much weight to give them. What pushed him past the threshold of ordinary professional caution was the convergence. 4 separate continental drainage systems, all showing evidence of significant structural alteration within a recent and roughly comparable time window, in a pattern that normal rates of geomorphological change could not account for. He completed the first fully drafted version of his final map in the autumn of 1814. It was a single sheet, approximately 1 metre by 1.5 metres at the drawing scale he worked in, covering the entire eastern hemisphere with a level of river system detail that had never been attempted at that scale. What it showed, when you looked at the cumulative picture rather than any individual region in isolation, was a version of the world's drainage geography that the landscape itself contained the ghost of: dry channels, elevated lake terraces, anomalous alluvial deposits, the subtle topographical signatures of water that had once moved in ways it no longer did, but that no currently published or officially sanctioned map acknowledged in any form. He wrote to 3 colleagues in December of 1814 describing the map and asking for their assessment. 2 did not respond. The third, a senior cartographer at the French Dépôt de la Guerre, wrote back at length and in terms that Voss described in his subsequent correspondence as unexpected. His colleague did not dispute the cartographic evidence. He advised Voss, with what Voss read as genuine personal concern rather than professional rivalry, that the institutional moment was not favourable for work that kind. The Congress of Vienna was in session. The major European powers were in the process of redrawing political geography on a scale not seen in a generation. In that context, his colleague wrote a map suggesting that the physical geography of the world was itself less stable and less settled than the institutions of those powers required their subjects to believe was not a map that would find a publisher or a patron. He suggested Voss wait, perhaps indefinitely. Then April of 1815 arrived, and with it an event that settled every argument Voss had been having with himself about whether his evidence was sufficient. On April 5th, 1815, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, erupted with a force that remains, in the historical record, the most powerful volcanic event in the last 10,000 years. The eruption ejected approximately 160 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The immediate death toll was 71,000 people. The longer-term consequences reached every corner of the globe. The following year, 1816, entered history as the year without a summer, a global temperature drop caused by volcanic ash blanketing the upper atmosphere that caused crop failures across Europe, North America and Asia simultaneously, triggering famines, migrations and social disruptions on every inhabited continent. Voss was not alive to see the worst of it. What he wrote in the weeks immediately following the Tambora eruption, before its global consequences were yet understood, is the most striking material in his surviving notebooks. He had been arguing for years that the physical landscape of the world had undergone rapid, large-scale change in a period not far in the past. Tambora was not that change. It was too recent, too identifiable, too well witnessed. But it was, he wrote, legible as evidence of something he had been seeing in the drainage record all along, that the geological and atmospheric systems governing the world's surface were capable, within human-scale time, of reorganizing the landscape at a magnitude that the prevailing assumptions of European science were not prepared to accommodate. He submitted the atlas with the final map to a publisher in Amsterdam in June of 1815. It was declined. He submitted it to two publishers in London. Both declined, one of them returning the manuscript with a letter indicating that while the cartographic draftsmanship was of exceptional quality, the geographical claims would require independent corroboration before the House could consider them. He submitted it to the Académie des Sciences in Paris. It was received, catalogued, and placed in review. The review was never completed. The atlas does not appear in the Academy's published catalogue of received works for the years 1815 or 1816, though Voss's own correspondence confirms the submission date. Henri Voss died in Utrecht in March of 1817. He was 51 years old. The death was attributed to a fever of the kind that was killing significant numbers of people across northern Europe in the aftermath of the Tambora-driven agricultural collapse. He left behind his workshop, his instruments, his correspondence, and his notebooks. He did not leave behind the atlas. The atlas does not appear in the probate inventory of his estate. It does not appear in the catalogue of his draftsmanship archive, which was purchased in 1819 by a collector in Leiden, whose library was subsequently dispersed at auction in 1847. Researchers attempting to trace the atlas through the auction records have found a category entry in the 1847 sale catalogue, a large format manuscript described only as a geographical work, undated, unattributed, sold as part of a mixed lot that some have argued corresponds to it. The purchaser of that lot is recorded only by a lawyer's name, acting as agent, representing a client who is not identified. The notebooks survived because Voss's daughter kept them. They passed through 3 generations of the family before being donated to the Utrecht University Library in 1931, where they have been catalogued and occasionally consulted by historians of cartography. They are not a secret. They are simply not famous because the story they tell is one that the disciplines most equipped to evaluate it, hydrology, geomorphology, the history of cartography, have tended to approach from within frameworks that were substantially built after 1815, and that treat the pre-1815 geographical record as something to be corrected by later precision rather than as a source of information in its own right. Here is what modern hydrology does know, independent of Voss and without reference to him. The Aral Sea in Central Asia was one of the 4 largest lakes in the world as recently as 1960. By 2007, it had lost 90% of its volume, largely due to Soviet irrigation projects diverting the rivers that fed it. The point is not the modern diversion. The point is the rate of change. A body of water of that scale, altered beyond recognition within half a century. The pre-modern drainage record of Central Asia contains evidence of comparable changes in the basin's recent history, changes that occurred without any identified engineering cause, and that conventional models have not fully accounted for. Voss's sources were describing something in that region. What exactly they were describing is still an open question in the historical hydrology literature. The Sahara contains beneath its surface the fossil drainage channels of rivers that were active as recently as 5,000 years ago, and in some sub-regions based on the stratigraphic evidence considerably more recently than that. The question of what caused the transition from the Green Sahara to the hyper-arid desert, and specifically the question of how rapid that transition was at various points in the record, remains genuinely contested in the paleoclimatology literature. Voss's West African sources were describing changes in that drainage system's recent history. How recent is a question his atlas, had it survived and been taken seriously, might have helped to frame. The Mississippi River naturally migrates its main channel over time, in a process called avulsion, switching between different distributary paths on timescales of centuries. The Red River raft, a massive natural logjam that blocked the Red River for approximately 170 miles, was actively redirecting drainage patterns in the Mississippi system when 17th century French Jesuit missionaries were compiling the accounts Voss later drew upon. It was cleared by American engineers between 1833 and 1873 The drainage geography of the region those Jesuit accounts described before the clearing was structurally different from the drainage geography that post-1833 surveys recorded. Voss was reading the Jesuit accounts correctly. He was seeing a system in transition. What his final map showed was not a fantasy. It was not the invention of a man who had spent too many years alone with contradictory sources and had allowed them to bend his judgment past. Reliability, it was an attempt, the most comprehensive attempt made by anyone in his era, possibly in any era before the satellite age, to draw the world's river systems as the accumulated evidence of primary sources suggested they had actually been, rather than as the conventions of the published cartographic tradition had agreed to represent them. The published cartographic tradition won. It always does, not through suppression most of the time, but through the more ordinary mechanism of institutional consensus, the slow accumulation of maps that cite other maps, editions that correct their predecessors on points of surveying precision, while inheriting without examination their fundamental geographical assumptions until the picture is so thoroughly established that challenging it requires not just new evidence, but a willingness to argue against everything that has been built on top of it. Voss was not willing to stop arguing. The institutions of 1815 were not willing to listen. The atlas went into a lawyer's lot at auction in 1847, and has not been publicly seen since. The rivers he drew are still out there in the landscape, encoded in the dry channels and elevated terraces and anomalous alluvial patterns of 4 continents. They have been there all along. They are in the geological record of every watershed he documented. They simply have not, in the 200 years since Henri Voss tried to show them to the world, been on any map that anyone was allowed to buy.